My name's Kitty Benford, and this is my story of my experience with GSS, a prion disease. My earliest memory of kind of knowing there was something wrong in the family was, I think I was in year 9, I was about 14, and we hadn't really spoken to my uncle Kenny for a long while. There'd been, you know, as there is in every family, there's disputes and people fall out. And when I was about 14, we found out that there was something wrong with Kenny. I don't really ever recall remembering or knowing what was wrong. I just remember knowing that he was sick and that there was no cure for whatever he had. They'd eventually got through to the prion clinic in London, who had confirmed that it was a prion disease, which then meant that we knew it was hereditary. And my uncle Philip, who was the oldest of the 7, started to display, similar symptoms and wasn't able to walk and was slurring his words. And within maybe a year or so, Philip had been diagnosed with it as well. Then in that August, when I was 15, we found out that Mum had it. So what my mum had was an illness called Gertsmann-Straussler-Scheinker syndrome, which we shortened to GSS. And essentially what it is, it's a motor neuron disease, which is where faulty prions in the brain replicate and create holes in the brain tissue. So when my mum died, if you were to take her brain out of her head and look at her brain, it would have been like a coral sponge. It would have had lots of holes all the way through it. So what GSS actually does is, obviously, as it creates holes in the brain, your brain loses that connectivity to create the pathways and tell your body how to do stuff. And then the September in 2011, my Uncle Kenny died. And I think that really brought it home to all of us. We suddenly all realised kind of what those timeframes were. And I felt very guilty actually when Kenny died, because I hadn't been to see him towards the end. And then the following year, the following September, my Uncle Philip died. And I had gone to see him before he died. And I regretted it, because he was so emaciated, so skinny and grey, and I just couldn't get that picture out of my head for the rest of the time that Mum was alive, because I knew what was coming. So the first things that tend to go are your motor skills. So she was kind of using a walker all the time. You ultimately end up in a wheelchair. She lost the function to be able to talk clearly. When my mum stopped being able to communicate using verbal words, it was the hardest thing for me, because I suddenly felt really out of control, and I couldn't understand what it was she needed or what she wanted from us. I was very lucky though with Mum, because GSS can sometimes also lead to dementia. She didn't ever get to that point. She never forgot who we were. And I think for me that would have probably been even worse if I'd have walked into a room, for example, and she didn't recognise me, or all of those things. And then kind of as you get right towards the end, even the ability to be able to swallow food stops, because your brain doesn't know how to do it anymore. And essentially they kind of become this vegetable. And then in the summer between my first and second year at university, Mum passed away. And the day it happened, it was a Sunday, the 13th of July in 2014, and I'd gone over in the morning. My stepdad had stayed overnight, and I'd gone in and said, I'm going to stay here for the day, so if you want to go home and have a shower and, have a break, go. And he did, and I sat in the room and I had my Kindle and I was holding her hand and I was just reading the book out loud, because she wasn't unconscious, but she just was not in this world. She was in bed. I wouldn't say she was asleep either, she just wasn't responsive. And I was holding her hand and I just thought, I can't really do anything else other than let her know I'm here and make sure she can hear me. So I thought, well, I'll just read to her. And within about 20 minutes of my stepdad leaving, I must have said something that was funny, and she squeezed my hand and opened her eyes very slightly and sort of looked over to me and closed her eyes again. And then about 5 minutes after, I remember feeling her hands had gone really cold. They were generally cold anyway, but they'd gone really cold. So we went and got a nurse, and at this point they could only find 1 pulse in every minute. When a human is about to die, there is a noise that they make. And you will have never have heard this noise before. It sounds so alien. You can physically hear how hard their body is working to still breathe. And this noise was happening so much slower, and I knew that she was leaving us. So they brought the nurse in and she said, we're struggling to find a pulse. So I rang my stepdad and I said, they think she's going, you need to come back. So he drove back, but before he'd got back, they'd pronounced her dead, and I'd sat next to her the whole time, holding her hand and just waiting for her to take that last and make that last noise. I wouldn't even say it was a breath, it was like this croaky, it was just horrible. It sounded like there was something inside her. And I'm really thankful that she died knowing it was me that was there. And then from there, everything kind of just... I stopped feeling the guilt, the anger, I just was over it by that point. The grieving, I very much believe I lived a lot of the grieving period while my mum was still alive. I was absolutely ready for her to go, and for a long time I felt awful for saying that, but I think it would have been torture to keep her on this earth any longer. So this is a card that my mum made and sent to my auntie Ruth for Christmas one year from herself and I. And my birthday last year, I had her handwriting that says lots of love tattooed on my arm, because when I write that phrase in cards, it's almost identical. Obviously, I don't know if I have the gene or not, but when we met, I was quite open about it, which was a bit of a weird conversation to have on a first date in a restaurant in our town. I don't really remember what I said, I just remember being really open about it and sort of being like, just so you know, my mum died at 45 and I might do too, so if you're not okay with that, that probably gives the answer to a lot of the questions about whether we're going to work or not.
Yeah, there wasn't really much of a conversation, you just sort of said it, and I think at the time I didn't process it, because when you're on a first date you're just going to go, yeah, sure, yeah.
So what you're saying is that you wish you'd have spent more time thinking about it?
Well, I think as our relationship's progressed, I've learned more about it, and I've taken it upon myself to learn more about it, because it's such a big deal in your life, and because I'm in your life, then it's like, I don't want to say it's my problem too, but I feel like I take on some of the burden, so it's better for me if I understand it.
To be fair though, like day to day, doesn't really impact anything obviously for me, I've got family members that are still going through it, so there's like the emotional impact of it, but in terms of like me being at risk, it doesn't really impact our kind of day-to-day planning the things that we want to do. The only time it's going to is that, if and when the time comes we decide to have kids. in the past, having kids has been a real worry for me, and that comes from a place of when my mum told us she was poorly, the first thing she said was, if I'd have known, I would have never have had kids. And that's stuck with me, you know, all these years. So for me, the moment I started a new relationship with somebody, I had to be really clear about what the implications of the GSS stuff was. And actually, if having kids was something they were really keen on, they needed to know all of the ins and outs of that. So for a long time, the thought of having to go through IVF, I always thought would put somebody off. Actually, we're in a position now where the IVF thing is much easier to manage. So because our kids have a 25% chance, I don't need to find out if I have the gene or not now. They will still provide IVF for the first round at least, and remove any eggs of mine that are negative to the gene, without telling me whether they find any that are positive, because obviously if there are positive eggs, then we know that I have the gene.
For me personally, there's no point in worrying about it, because if the time comes where, you know, there's got to be a call for action to get help and care and whatever else, then that'll be then, but it's not now. So I'd rather just enjoy the moment, basically.
When my mum first died, because obviously that's kind of the most intimate of dealing with it that I've had so far, keeping busy was really important. So knowing what I was doing day in and day out, and I guess that's more about a grief thing. That's just kind of how I work best. And then I guess it's not sitting with it for too long. I think if I sit with it for too long, I become kind of indulged by it, and I become a bit woe is me, and I don't really want to get on with other things, and that's not helpful. So yeah, I really deal with it by acknowledging that it is a thing, but not letting it consume me. So, you know, when I trip over, acknowledging I just tripped over, but that's not because I've got this gene, that's just because I'm clumsy. But yeah, so for me it's just about knowing that that's a thing and not being consumed by it day in, day out, because I don't think I'd be a very nice person then. In a nutshell, GSS has taken my nan from our family, it's taken my Uncle Philip, my Uncle Kenny, my mum, my Auntie Ruth who now has it, and of those 4 brothers and sisters that have had it, they've got 10 kids, and some of them have got kids. And because it's hereditary, there's a 1 in 2 chance that they're going to have it too. So potentially in the next 30 years, I could be looking at burying another 10 members of my family easily. I'm sick to death of constantly having to think about who's going to be next, or how much can we cram into the time we have got left.